In this lecture, you'll learn how to debug a console app in Visual Studio. Before we do that, we should talk a little bit about how the debugging process works. So typically what happens is you discover a bug in your code. Your code is not behaving the way it's supposed to behave. The next thing you do is you form a hypothesis about what could be causing that bug. And I will freely admit that I will often fire up Visual Studio and get ready to start debugging before I've formed my hypothesis, but that's a delaying tactic. I want to be doing something as I'm trying to form my hypothesis. And I could go read a book or go for a run or something, but usually I fire up Visual Studio. The next thing that you do is you use the debugger to find out if your hypothesis was correct, or you find out your hypothesis wasn't correct and you keep debugging to find the actual cause of the bug. And I don't mean the formal statistical testing where we're going to reject the null hypothesis given some confidence. I just mean we're going to see if our guess is correct, and if it is, or even if it isn't, and we discover the actual source of the bug, the last step in the process is we fix the bug. And hopefully that means your code will work fine. Sometimes that means you find another bug and you go through this process again. Okay, let's go see how we actually do this debugging process in Visual Studio. This is the code that we're going to debug. And as you can see, I've declared a float angle variable. I prompt for and get the angle, I convert the angle to radians, and then I print out the cosine and sine of that angle. When I run my code and enter 45 because I know the answer, I can tell that I'm getting the incorrect answer here. So there's something wrong in my code. My first hypothesis might be that I'm reading in the angle incorrectly. So we can check that using the debugger. I'm going to set what's called a breakpoint on line 23. And a breakpoint is a point at which the code breaks or stops when the execution of the code reaches that breakpoint. To set a breakpoint, I come over here on the left in this gray vertical bar and I left click. And now you can see I have a breakpoint set there because I have this red circle over here. And I can remove a breakpoint by clicking on that breakpoint again. But I want a breakpoint set there, and when the code stops at this breakpoint, I can check to see if I'm reading in the angle properly. When I run in debug mode, I don't want to just use Control F5 to run my code. I want to use F5. And you can also, of course, come up to this top menu bar and select Start Debugging to do that as well. So when I start debugging, my code starts running. It prompts for an angle from the user. I'll enter 45. And then the code stops here. I'm going to turn on the magnifier. And we can tell where the code has stopped because we have a yellow arrow inside this red circle. So this is the line of code that we're stopped at. We've executed everything above this line of code, but we haven't executed this line of code yet. There are a couple of different ways I can find out the current value of angle. I can hover over the variable, and as you can see, it tells me that angle is 45. And I can also come down here and take a look at the value of angle down here, and as you can see, it's 45 down here as well. So my hypothesis that we might be reading in the angle incorrectly is not right. There's something else going wrong with the code. Let's think about what happens next. Now we need to convert this angle of 45 into radians. And 45 degrees is pi over 2 radians, which is approximately 1.5, because pi is 3.14, and if we have pi over 2, then it's about 1.57. So we can check to see if our conversion is working properly by executing this next line of code and then looking at the value of angle again. There are a couple of different ways we can step over this line of code. I can press F10, or I can go up to my top menu bar and I can say debug step over. Typically, of course, I just use F10. So I'll F10. And now, as you can see, the yellow arrow is now on the next line of code. So I executed line 23. And if we hover over angle, we can see a big massive number. That is not 1.57. We can also look at the value of angle down below in this window. And Visual Studio will actually color in red the values that have changed by executing the code that we just executed. So it's easy to glance down here in this window and see what changed, because what changed turns red. But we've found our problem. We know that we're not converting our angle from degrees to radians properly. I'm going to turn off the magnifier, and I'm going to stop debugging, and you can stop debugging by clicking this red square or using Shift F5. And I'm going to turn off this breakpoint because I don't think I'm going to need it anymore. This is the line of code that is causing us trouble. And if we think about this, we realize that I've done this conversion exactly backwards. I don't multiply by degrees and divide by radians, because if we think about the units that would result in, I'm taking an angle in degrees and I'm multiplying by degrees and dividing by radians, so the resulting units would be degrees squared over radians. That's obviously incorrect. I want to multiply by radians and divide by degrees. So instead of doing this, I need to do this to do my conversion. And if I run my code again now and enter 45, you'll see that my sine and cosine are correct. I, of course, could have continued using the debugger to check that my angle was correct after I made this code change, but I had high confidence that, in fact, I had fixed the problem, so I just ran the code. I do want to remind you of the fact that floating point numbers and doubles, any floating point number in a computer suffers from rounding error. So if I run the code again and I say 90 degrees, I know that cosine should be 0 and sine should be 1. But it turns out that cosine is a very, very small number. That's negative 4.371139 times 10 to the negative 8. So that's pretty small. It's not exactly 0, but it's pretty small. And I do get 1 for my sine. So that's just a reminder, that's not a bug in the code. That's a side effect of the fact that we've converted from the continuous domain of real numbers in the real world to the discrete domain of floating point numbers in our computer. I could change angle to double and do everything as doubles here, and I would be closer to 0, but I still wouldn't be at exactly 0 for 90 degrees. And as I've said, that's just a characteristic of floating point numbers in the computer. To recap, in this lecture we talked about the steps we go through as we debug our code, and we saw how to use the debugger in Visual Studio.